Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple of things we'd like to say before we start our program this evening. I would ask you first to silence your phones. Unless it's God calling, we don't want to hear it ring. And please, would you hold your applause until all the stories have been told? Thank you. Welcome, everybody. In keeping with the first-person storytelling narrative, let me introduce myself in my biblical name. I am Mary, wife of Clopas. There's very little known about me or about the other ladies that you will meet here today. But we will tell you our stories. How did we come about to tell you these stories? Well, in 2012, Pope Benedict XVI, in his apostolic letter, Porta Fide, declared that year as a year of faith. And he encouraged Catholics and others to search their ancestry through the Bible, complete with the interweavings of holiness and sin. So the Basilica community builders decided to do just that. They searched their ancestry. They wrote the stories. They gave us a voice. For we are very much like you. We had relationships, we had struggles. We are real. Let me tell you a few things about myself. My husband and I were on the road to Jerusalem. We were going to see Jesus, the Messiah. Along the way, we were told that Jesus had died. He had been crucified for his teachings and prophecies. We were despaired, as you can well imagine. So we turned and we walked back the road towards Emmaus, our home. Along the way, we met a stranger. He asked us why we were so forlorn. We told him that Jesus had died and we really didn't know what to do next. For Jesus was going to be the one who would bring us out of Israel. He looked at us and he said, "You shouldn't worry, for you will be led out of Israel by your prayer to God and through your faith." We invited him to our home that night, and custom in our home, when a stranger comes to your home, you wash their hands, anoint their head with oil, and wash their feet. As we sat down to our meal, the stranger took the bread. He blessed it, broke it, and he gave it to us. And immediately our hearts were open, for we knew then that this was Jesus, the Messiah. He had risen, and then he disappeared. We immediately left our home and rushed back towards Jerusalem to proclaim that Jesus had risen. The resurrection had happened. And now this afternoon you will hear from other stories. The Basilica community builders have once again gotten together in this year of new beginnings, our parish, which was declared by the Basilica parish All of the searches were very difficult for these stories, for there were only fragments of information. But they took those fragments, wove them together, and wrote the stories. So you will hear from Sarah. You will hear from Shiphrah. You will hear from the woman at the well. Then the women of Jerusalem at the 8th station. One of these ladies will be speaking to you in her own native Ukrainian language. And then you will hear from Lydia. So sit back, listen, and learn from our stories. For we are your ancestors, and one day you too will be ancestors to yet another generation. For we are your yesterday. You are our tomorrow. And as we have done, you too must do. Leave your mark of faith.
I begin by telling you that my birth name was Sarai, which means princess. God changed my name to Sarah later, and I'll tell you about that a little further along in my story. I am best known as the wife of Abraham. His name was changed too by God from Abram to Abraham when he entered into a covenant with God. But I remember him affectionately as Abraham. When I was 65 and Abraham was 75, we had to leave our country, Canaan, because of a severe famine. And we headed off to Egypt. Well, Egypt was very different from Canaan. Women, especially beautiful women, were sometimes taken and their husbands were killed. Well, Abraham knew that I was beautiful, even at that age. So he told me to say that I was his sister, so that his life would be spared and that he would have riches. And so it was. I pretended to be Abraham's sister. But this plan to keep Abraham safe meant a great cost to both of us. The Pharaoh was indeed attracted to me, and I had to give in. I was taken into his harem. I was nothing more than a prized possession. Please don't judge me for this. I did what I had to do. I gave myself to the Pharaoh to save Abraham's life. And if I hadn't done that, there would have been no Abraham, no Isaac, or no Jacob. But seeing my suffering and sacrifice, God afflicted Pharaoh's house with a great plague. When Pharaoh realized it was our lie that was causing this, he told us to leave his home and leave Egypt. But he gave us a parting gift, and her name was Hagar, so she was given to us as a maidservant. by the time I was 75, I still had not given Abraham any children. And you don't know what that was like in my time. I was barren. And barrenness felt like a curse because Abraham was a great leader, and I couldn't give him any children. So I asked Abraham to sleep with Hagar to produce a child. And it wasn't long before Hagar became with child. And she gave birth to a son, Ishmael. I was filled with joy. But this joy was short-lived because I was angry at myself, angry at Abraham, angry at Hagar. We fought a lot. I was so angry with Abraham, and I continued to tell him so. Years later, I was in the back of my tent when 3 men visited Abraham. Of course, they couldn't see me, and I couldn't see them, but I could hear them. And they said to Abraham, "The time has come for Sarah to bear fruit. She will give you a son, and you will call him Isaac." Of course, this was the time I had lost my faith, because I was old by now, and I really didn't think I could become pregnant. So I laughed within myself. Well, the man said to Abraham, why is she laughing? And Abraham said, "I don't hear anyone laughing," because I was laughing to myself, and surely they could not hear this. But hear me they could. It was then my faith was restored, and I realized that they were God himself. And I instantly believed them, and my faith was recovered. I soon found out I was with child. And Abraham made a great feast day on the day that our son was born. We named him Isaac, just as the Lord foretold, because this was in fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation. This was when God changed my name from Sarai to Sarah, now to mean Princess of Nations. I am the only woman in the Bible that I know of whose name was changed by God. Meanwhile, I was still struggling to accept Hagar and Ishmael. I noticed Ishmael mocking my young son Isaac, and it was more than I could bear. So I said to Abraham to banish Hagar and Ishmael from our household. Of course, Abraham didn't want to do this because he truly loved Ishmael, his firstborn son. But God instructed Abraham to do as I asked. He said, "Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her. For in Isaac your seed shall be multiplied." Imagine, God asked Abraham to listen to me, and Abraham did as God instructed. You must know that Ishmael was not abandoned by God. He too became the leader of a great nation in his own right. And there remained a family tie between the lines of both brothers. Although I did not live to bear witness to this, I do know that together Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham alongside me in a plot of land called the Cave of the Patriarchs. This land is still visited today by many holy people and is considered one of the most visited places to pray in that area. I died at the age of 127. Yes, you heard that right, 127. While my earthly journey ends here, I am part of biblical history. By a miracle, God gave Abraham his promised heir through me, Sarah, a sinner who at times lost faith. I am blessed to have been chosen by God to be the mother of Isaac, from whom countless multitudes, nations, and kings came from. The most notable king being King David, from whom Jesus himself would come. Looking back and learning what was to come, I believe I am an important woman of the Bible and an example that with God, nothing is impossible. Even when you lose faith, you can restore that faith, and God makes everything possible.
Hello, my name is Shiphrah. I'm a midwife. I lived around the 13th century before Christ. My story is recorded in the Old Testament with another midwife named Puah. It was describing how we disobeyed the Pharaoh. And our lessons are that despite the passage of time, one major life truth has not changed. It takes a great deal of faith and courage to do the right thing. We were not heroines. We simply followed our hearts as guided by the Lord our God of Israel. In him we trusted, and in him we believed. My name, Shiphrah, means to be fair or to improve. And it's a common tradition today that we name our children after somebody in our family, somebody that we respect, or by the meaning of the name. As a midwife, I attended countless birthings. I supported women, assisted women, and guiding them through the process, that miracle called birth. Sometimes it was relatively easy and quick. Sometimes. Most times it was very laborious, especially if it was the first baby. And this is noted in Genesis, which says, "I will increase your trouble in pregnancy and your pain in giving birth." And this was especially true for young women who were brides, that they joined their husbands and moved away to faraway lands. They felt alone, afraid, and overwhelmed. So it was my delight to be able to assist them. Although we had no refined tools at that time for assisting in childbirth, we were, however, very skilled. I was taught by many midwives who came before me. Most midwives of our time were barren, and people would snicker, saying that barren women were unclean and thus unworthy to have children in the eyes of God. My midwife friends and I truly believed that God did not judge us by our fertility. God is right and just, full of love and mercy, wise above all. And instead of being cast aside, as was most often the tradition in our time, we had a very important role to play. I would attend a birth, often with another midwife to assist, and we did our best to create that safe, calm space so we could soothe them between their pains. We would massage their backs and their feet, and sometimes, when they could no longer stand or sit or walk or move, we did fashion a chair out of bricks or rocks to help them and ease that time in between. During the process, we would encourage them, reminding them, "That's it, you've got this." And when they felt overwhelmed, I would just look at them, hold their hands or put their hand on their chest and remind them, "That's it, you're doing great. Breathe with me. You've got this." As the babe would come forth, we would rejoice at his first cry. And then we would relax in delight when we saw that the babe would make its way snuggling up to mom's breast and suckle for the first time. Life was truly good. Thanks be to God. One day, Pua and I were called before the Pharaoh. He had ordered that all newborn children were to be killed the minute they took their first breath. We were horrified. You see, the Pharaoh had a great fear that the Hebrew people would rise up against the Egyptians. Those Israelites, despite their bondage, were suffering at the hands of the Egyptians. But they remained steadfast in their belief in God and his promise to bring them out of this bondage. Their faith was strong in a God that they just simply couldn't see. Pua and I also had great faith in God. We were committed. We decided to defy the Pharaoh and put our trust in the Lord our God, because in our hearts we knew that killing innocent children, despite their race or their religion, was truly wrong. Many of you may be wondering, how did we defy the Pharaoh? It was really simple. When we were attending a birth, we would simply tell the mom, "We must hide the baby now. Hide the baby until the time comes when it is safe." And many of them did. But when the Pharaoh heard that many Hebrew women were still having babies, he called us to attend to him once more. He was angry. He wanted an explanation. So Pua and I decided what we would say to him, and it is also recorded in Exodus. The Hebrew women are not like other women, Pharaoh. You see, they give birth quickly and easily, long before we can attend to them. Well, little white lie, God will forgive us. Thankfully, Pharaoh accepted our explanation and allowed us to go free. Pharaoh had another command, and it was for the soldiers to drown the newborn males in the Nile. Despite his best efforts, however, the Pharaoh could not drown one particular baby boy. This boy became the man who, with the Lord God of Israel, freed the Israelites from bondage. This boy's name was Moses. Pua and I were instrumental in saving his life because we attended his mother, Jochebed, at her birth of Moses, and she was a fellow midwife. As midwives, it is our calling to protect mothers and babies during this beautiful process, this miraculous process called childbirth. This was my calling. This was my gift, a gift from God. I served the Lord God of Israel, and he was pleased. We were well rewarded. I had a wonderful life. All thanks be to God. I was truly blessed to be born Shiphrah, the midwife.
It happened one day. It was an ordinary day, but it was the day my whole life changed. As I walked from the village, I could see a figure at the well. Who was this? No movement from the figure, even though I could see they were aware of me coming. No one to speak to, as I walked alone to the well as usual. The other women of the village go earlier, but I do not walk with them, rather going to the well when I can be sure there will be nobody there. Each day I set out around noon. Yes, the hottest time of the day, but is the time I can be assured of being alone and therefore safe. As I approached the well, I could see this figure was a man. Strange that he would just stay sitting there as I drew nearer. Most men move away when a woman is approaching, and especially me. I struggled. Ought I go back and come at another time? Yet I needed the water. We were all out, and I knew now was the only time I could fetch this much-needed water. I shook my head and kept going, hoping he would move. But no, he stayed. Oh well, I reminded myself, I will just go, fetch the water, and ignore him. As I approached, I could feel his eyes on me, looking and watching. I was a bit afraid. I stole some glances at him and realized he was a Jew. Now, what was a Jew doing at our well? The likelihood of his speaking to me was low, so I continued. You see, I am a Samaritan, and we Samaritans do not get along with the Jews. Also, I am a woman. He is a Jewish man. On reaching the well, I set about lowering my bucket, trying to keep one eye on this Jewish fellow. He looked at me and smiled. What was he playing at? I ignored him. Then he asked me for a drink. What on earth is going on? I said to him, What? You, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink? He then went on to tell me if only I knew who was asking for the drink, and he said something about it being living water. I answered him by pointing out he had no bucket. The well was deep, and therefore, how did he propose to get a drink? I referred to the story of the well and how Jacob, our father, had given this well to us, even drinking from it himself. He smiled and went on speaking to me about water, how anyone who drank from this well would get thirsty again, but he had a source of water which would satisfy thirst forever. Did he take me for a fool? Water that would satisfy a thirst forever. I asked him to give me some of the water, as I would never get thirsty again and would never have to come to the well. He then asked me to go and tell my husband. Now things changed. You see, I have no husband. I told him so. He said I was correct in saying I had no husband, telling me that the man I was now with is not my husband, the present man being the sixth one I am with. This shocked me. How did he know? He must have met somebody who told him. But there was something in the way he looked at me. Not a look like other men. No, there was something about him that, while scaring me a bit, also made me very curious. I wanted to hear more. I ventured to speak to him about our prophets and how we challenge the Jewish insistence that Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. I listened as he continued. Believe me, woman, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. For salvation comes from the Jews. But the hour will come. In fact, it is here already, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. This is the kind of worshipper the Father wants. God is spirit, and those who worship must worship in spirit and truth. I thought about what he was saying and said to him, I know that the Messiah, that is Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will tell us everything. He answered me, I, who am speaking to you, I am he. You know, I believed him. I knew in my heart he was telling the truth. Our conversation was cut short as a voice shouted, What are you doing speaking to her? His companions were returning. I still had my water jar, so I put it down and I ran back to the village. I did not care what anyone thought of me as I ran through the village, telling all to come and to meet a man who had told me all I ever did. They came out and went to meet him. He came and stayed with us for a few days, he and his band of followers. The village was never the same place again. All changed that day. I often think of that man and the conversation we shared, how I have changed due to the encounter at the well. I am not known by my name for all to remember. I was a woman, an outcast of my village, a Samaritan speaking to a sworn enemy, a Jew. Yet I am all women who dare to venture to speak to a stranger at the well at the hottest time of the day, listening to what he had to say, without feeling guilty about my life and how I live it. Amazing what can happen at a well.
We have no name by which to introduce ourselves. Our names are known only to God. What you're about to hear is not our story, but our place in a story. Who we were by name carries no significance to the story, but perhaps you might have been one of us if our time had been your time.
This is a story of what began with the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We say began as the most tragic story of all time, because this story had the most glorious of endings, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The suffering endured by Jesus at the crucifixion was the most painful for us to witness. We are the women of Jerusalem who met Jesus on his way to his death. Perhaps it is better to say that he met us, and he looked at us saying,
Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children.
Дочки Єрусалимські, не плачте наді мною, а плачте над собою і над вашими дітьми.
If you've ever made the way of the cross, you know what took place at each station. Centuries have passed, but the pain of what took place cannot be erased by time. The cross has come to symbolize what Jesus gained for humankind through the cross, not what was lost.
Women, like men, could be disciples of Jesus. To be a disciple meant that one was willing and committed to following Jesus as he taught and healed and called people to be part of the reign of God. As disciples, some of us provided food and lodging to Jesus and the apostles, while others left our own homes to follow Jesus as he preached from town to town. Some women allowed people to meet in their homes to hear the good news. We were ordinary women. We held no public title. We were disciples of Jesus who chose to be there on that most horrendous of days. We chose to be there. It was an act of great courage for us to be there because society had turned against Jesus. And he was being condemned to death now as an enemy of the state and of the people for the message that he had proclaimed of liberty to captives and freedom to those imprisoned. Anyone who had been known to be a follower of his risked violence or even death also. But we felt that the man who had shown us that we had dignity and worth now deserved our support in his time of need.
What you might not see if you just look at us on the surface is that in following Jesus, we had become a community. We were not only friends, but we also learned to call each other to more, just as he had called us to more. We cared for one another's children, dried one another's tears, cooked one another's meals, applauded one another's gifts, and built up one another's spirits. Later, a doctor named Albert Schweitzer said, "Sometimes our light goes out, but it is blown again into flame by an encounter with another human being. Each of us owes the deepest thanks to those who have rekindled the light. We were that for each other on that day and on so many days afterwards.
Ісуса заарештували як злочинця. Цієї ночі він повівся не так, як завжди. У нього не було ні зброї, ні слів гніву. Його заарештували без ніякої причини. Однак були й ті, що боялися Ісуса. Вони боялися, що люди можуть захотіти піти за Ісусом і зробити Його своїм царем. Первосвященники та весь Синедріон шукали ложного свідоцтва на Ісуса, щоб Його бити, і не знайшли, дарма що було з'явилося багато ложних свідків.
The chief priests and the whole council tried to find some false evidence against Jesus to put him to death. But they could not find any, even though many people came forward and told lies about him.
Навіть тодішній цар Понтій Пилат знав, що немає жодних звинувачень, які підтверджували арешт Ісуса. Але Пилат запитав, що злого вчинив він? Коли над Ісусом знущалися, то робили це найжахливішими способами. Вони плювали на нього. Тоді вони плювали йому в обличчя і били його, і ті, що били його в лице, промовляли: «Проречи нам, Христе, хто тебе вдарив?» Ісуса витягли з Гециманського саду. Отже, слова Святого Письма сповнилися словами, сказаними Ісусом під час арешту. Та все це сталося, щоб збулися писання пророків.
Jesus was condemned to death. We watched as the verdict was announced. Jesus was to be put to death. This wasn't just to be an execution, but rather a public humiliation. Jesus was to carry his cross to Calvary for everyone to see. How could they do this to a man who had shown nothing but love and compassion for people?
Ісусу дали нести важкий дерев'яний хрест. Його ноги ступали по нерівній землі, як хрест був покладений на його плечі. Здавалося, що хрест штовхнув його тіло вперед і глибоко впився в плече. Вага хреста вдарила його до землі і не один раз, а 3. Він піднявся і почав те, що буде відоме як хресна дорога. До того часу, як Ісус до того місця дійшов, де ми стояли, він вже двічі впав під важкою вагою Христа. Його смертне тіло було поранене і розбите. Здавалося, що він повинен був пасти задовго, як зустрів нас.
There were others there that day besides us. Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd to help Jesus carry the cross. Veronica wiped his face as blood spewed down from the wounds incurred by the crown of thorns. But perhaps the one person who suffered the grief and pain beyond what could ever be imagined was his mother Mary. In silence, she moved through the crowds, keeping pace with her son. All of us, unlikely companions, were united in this moment that changed everything. That day was unlike any other day in Jerusalem. There was a great noise among the crowds. Mobs of people chanted as the soldiers dragged Jesus through the streets. But there was also a deafening quiet, disbelief of what was taking place. We wept, and it was our weeping that Jesus responded to with these words:
Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children.
Дочки Єрусалимські, не плачте наді мною, але плачте над собою і над вашими дітьми.
We could not have known at that time what these words really meant. These words have since been repeated many times, countless times, as people make the way of the cross in your time. These words are repeated everywhere and every time that people try to unite their sufferings with the sufferings of Christ. It is true that our tears were turned to joy at the resurrection, but what we witnessed at the way of the cross will continue to be relived by humankind. It serves to remind the world that Jesus died because of his great love for all people. His people of my time, his people of your time, his people of time yet to come.
Welcome. My name is Lydia, so named for the province of my birth. I grew up in the town of Thyatira. Now it is true, these place names no longer exist, but present-day regions of Greece is where I was born. I am known as the seller of purple. Purple dye was much sought after in the ancient world. It was very expensive to buy, and I made a very good living as a businesswoman. I owned my own home. I had many servants who I treated justly. It may surprise you to hear that in my time, Macedonian women enjoyed greater freedom and power than any other women. We built temples, founded cities, engaged mercenaries, played important roles in town affairs, and even co-ruled. But despite this equality of freedom, the money and power, I was not satisfied. You see, something was missing. I was still not happy. I believed the one true God in my life would bring me that happiness. In Philippi, where this story unfolds, the Jewish women could pray publicly in groups by the river, which was needed for the ritual washing for prayer. And I, a non-Jew, would join them. I remember that Sabbath day like it was yesterday. While we were praying by the river, Paul and his companions, Silas and Timothy, came to the shore. Paul had had a dream. A figure said, "Come to Macedonia, help us." Now you see, they were not permitted to preach in our region. But Paul, after having the dream, interpreted as that was God's will. So Paul, when he arrived, found no synagogue to pray. As there were so few Jewish men, he had come to the river, our river. He preached the good news of Christ's salvation. I listened to his words, and the Lord opened my heart to Paul's message. I was baptized immediately. My whole household was baptized, and I became known as the first person in Europe to follow Christ. Paul's journey to Philippi was an answer to my prayers. The beginning of Christianity was founded. I vowed to use all my time, money, and talents as a businesswoman to further the word of the one true God, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Afterwards, I persuaded Paul and his companions to come to my home, saying, "If you believe me, a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." And they did. I continued to offer my home as a meeting place for the whole Christian community. So now you know my story, the seller of purple. My life was filled with such blessing and graces that I could have ever hoped. God opened my heart to receive his word. He answered my prayers and filled my heart with such joy that money, power, nor freedom could.
My biblical name is Miriam. I was the sister of Moses. I was the jealous sister who questioned why Moses was so blessed by God. However, I did not live a life of unrelenting jealousy. I knew I was created by an all-loving, all-forgiving God, and so I turned to him with my cries of atonement. He heard my cries. At the time of my death, the Lord God of Israel brought forth a spring of abundant water for the people of Meribah. My life was one filled with interweaving of holiness and sin. There are so many other biblical stories of women waiting to be told. The life stories of Hannah, Rahab, Esther, to name but a few. Then there are those women who have had to exist, yet there is no account of their lives. Judas Iscariot's mother, the mothers of the two men crucified on either side of Jesus. What might their stories reveal? I hope that throughout each story you have heard today, themes of independence, generosity, trust in the Lord, love of neighbor, preservation of life, hope and healing, and faith that conquers all. I now call each woman forward. Lydia, Sarah, Shiphrah, the woman at the well, the women of the 8th station, Mary, wife of Clopas, women of the harp, and I invite you to join with me to express our gratitude. As you leave here today, might I suggest that each of you take a closer look at not only your life story, but the life story of other women in today's world. Let history record these stories for generations to come as ones filled with the same biblical threads of courage, hope, love, and forgiveness, all gifts from our Creator. In closing, I want to thank everyone who took the time to come here today to hear the stories of our biblical ancestors. Wouldn't they be amazed to know that some are hearing their stories through video and audio technology that they could never dreamt of. But there's one story today that has yet to be told. And in order for that story to be told, we need to call forth the person of Ruth, Kay Barrington, who was our director in all this. Kay, would you please come forward? So now I'm going to tell you a little story. Once upon a time, in the year 2023, Pope Francis called a meeting in Rome known as a synod. People came from many countries and continents. They brought Pope Francis gifts that were exquisite and elegant: gold chalices, crystal vases. Our representative from Newfoundland, Sister Elizabeth Davis, knew the gift Pope Francis would appreciate, as he had written some himself. And so it was, knowing the power of a story, that Sister Elizabeth brought Francis a storybook entitled Walking Together. And this book tells a lot of themes that are part of a synod. And we were privileged to see a picture of Sister Elizabeth presenting that book to Pope Francis. The director of our stories, Women of the Bible, the woman whose biblical name is Ruth, knows we cannot know God without stories. We cannot know ourselves without stories. We cannot be the people of God without passing the story on to each generation. If Ruth was to present a book to Pope Francis, it would probably be entitled Women of the Bible, Once Upon a Biblical Time. Ruth knows and lives the power of biblical stories. She knows part of what draws us to a story is the promise of finding a different world, finding another time, finding ourselves. Kay, you have called us through our stories to celebrate women before us, to walk into sacred footprints, and to realize new dreams and ambitions. Thank you, Ruth, our director, for energizing us, inspiring us, inviting us to re-image and retell the stories anew, to enter into the story of God. And for all of us, may there always be a once upon a time moment in our lives so that our stories can continue our faith journey. Thank you. Oh, I'm supposed to say, would you like me to greet some of our biblical women?